Muito bem, logo após o encerramento desse nosso primeiro dia de atividades, teremos um coquetel oferecido pelo IRB aqui no subsolo, ok? O IRB oferece a todas as pessoas presentes um coquetel de congraçamento no subsolo. Será apresentada a nova marca e a nova empresa, ok? Logo após o final do nosso evento. O mundo está em permanente transformação. Mudanças climáticas, demográficas, urbanísticas e a própria globalização aceleram essas transformações e também geram grande impacto, não só no homem, mas também na economia, em todo o mundo. O futurólogo John Nascimento, autor do best-seller Megatendências em português, defende a tese de que a melhor maneira de antecipar o futuro é entendendo o presente. Vamos dar início ao último painel de hoje com o tema Megatendências da Indústria de Seguros no Mundo. Teremos como palestrante, e chamamos ao palco, o senhor Yoder, da PwC. Por favor. Como debatedores, convidamos o senhor Marco Antônio Rossi, presidente da CNseg. Senhor Marcio Coriolano, presidente da FenaSaúde. Convidamos também o senhor Marco Antônio da Silva Barros, presidente da FenaCap. Senhor Osvaldo do Nascimento, presidente da FenaPrevi. E o senhor Paulo Marraccini, que é presidente da FenSeg. E para atuar como mediadora, convidamos novamente a jornalista Luquet. Mara, pode assumir, com você.
Boa tarde. Nós vamos começar então, vamos combinar aqui como nós vamos fazer esse painel. Nós vamos começar ouvindo a palestra da PwC, do Yoder, e depois os debatedores vão comentar, enfim, a gente vai ter uma conversa aqui para comentar a apresentação e os dados que você vai apresentar.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be here, and certainly an honor to be here with this panel. Basically, we're going to spend I'm going to spend about 40 minutes with the brief presentation, and then we're going to discuss the future. So, the fun thing about the future is it's it's obviously further out there, and it's something that we want to look at in terms of, we want to take a long view. So, I love the title of the event, 2025. Certainly by taking an extremely long view, you challenge yourself to think about what things can happen in the midterm. And I think, if we look at the environment in which we operate, over the past, 5 years, we've seen disruption in many industries. Certainly, things like telecommunications, entertainment come to mind. Really movements from previously sort of commonly understood behaviors of customers, stable economics and competitors, and slow-moving technology to a more unpredictable world where those factors are up in the air. And as such, it's always great to take a step back and look at all the factors that are changing around us and think about what the implications to our industry could be, and where are those opportunities for us to identify opportunities to exploit the trends that are happening, or to defend against those things that are happening perhaps outside of our control, or that others may choose to capitalize on. I don't know how many people are familiar with Ray Kurzweil, sort of a noted futurist, a few. So what's interesting is while I think every generation says, things are getting faster and faster, the truth is they actually are. In this case, it's what Ray Kurzweil is noted as the law of accelerating returns. The speed of change is increasing, but at an increasing rate. So it is getting faster and faster on top of each other. So we have exponential change that's occurring. And the interesting thing about exponential change, in this particular case, he's plotted the adoption of all technologies. And you can see this is sort of on a logarithmic scale, sort of an exponential curve. And what's amazing about it is as a curve looks like this, we overestimate in the short term the impact of new innovations. So we overestimate those changes. You think about the hype cycle. I take you back in the late 90s. In the internet bubble, huge sort of hype around it's going to change everything, it's going to totally destroy it all. And then the bubble burst, and we looked at it and said, oh, see, it was overhyped, it was nothing. But what happens with the curve is that we greatly underestimate the impact in the long term. The good thing is as humans, we're very good at looking at the short term. We're very good at looking at the statistical long term. So we recognize that we're all living longer, and that's easy to compute. But we're not very good at sort of that mid-future. But what we are good is when things do change, we sort of assimilate to it very quickly and we take it for granted. So if you look back sort of 10 years and said, would we see the world that we see today? I mean, everybody's got their smartphone, iPhone, BlackBerry, whatever it is. Imagine, it wasn't that long ago when that wasn't, the ubiquitous communications, the ability to get to anybody you wanted, whenever, with real powerful information, was not that long ago. If you look at something, the rise of social networks, Facebook and the like, the fact that they have a community that is connected in very powerful ways that essentially is the size of the third largest country in the world, and the fact that people are very vocal on it, who would have predicted that kind of change? And even experts in their field tend to have the same problem in looking at this. So 10 years ago, the human genome, when they were first starting to decode the human genome, they basically estimated that it would take an additional, so these were the preeminent experts who'd actually cracked the code on the first portion of the genome, estimated it would take 50 years in order to actually drive the remainder. Instead, it took 13. So they were off by 4 times what it was. Additionally, the cost of decoding the genome has gone from $95 million to less than $6,000 in that time period. Now, I thought it was bad that I bought an iPad mini a few weeks ago and they just announced a new one. Imagine if you'd been the first one to buy a human genome. How disappointing that would have been. You would have blown a lot of money. But anyway, so this changes that are occurring when we want to take sort of a long view. We see signs of little innovations, but the question is, what can they mean to us? What can they mean to us as insurers? So the research that we've done, that I'd led on a global basis, we basically created a framework we call STEEP. So STEEP is intended to be both comprehensive, to look at all the drivers of change, the trends that are happening around us, but also as an indication of the degree of change that's happening within each of those. So STEEP stands for social, which is really about the demographic shifts, behavioral shifts, factors like stakeholder trust. T is for technology. Primarily, if you think about information, huge innovations and the pace of innovation and change that's happening in our ability to capture, consume, interpret, and use information in entirely new ways. As well as devices and sensors, medical advances, and then economic changes. I think we're all fully aware of what's happening there and how that affects us. And then environmental, so catastrophes, an increase in frequency and severity, as well as the amount of damage created by those events. And then political. Obviously, we operate in a heavily regulated industry, as well as a lot of geopolitical risk if we look at sort of the global stage. So I'm going to play just a quick video here just to, I think you've seen many of this information, but it's always nice to sort of get some context and look at how the world around us is changing. nice as the tune is. All right. You know, so I think, I'm sure everybody's seen many of those statistics and the amount of change, but I think, you know, I'm often sort of a bit overwhelmed when you look at it sort of all in one go, sort of as a torrent of information and change that's happening across all these dimensions. When I mentioned the 32 drivers of change within the STEEP framework, we talked about you know, the macroeconomic, you know, the statistics and the other sort of trends, general trends are very interesting. But I think what sort of brought it to life, and I think has been very impactful for us, is that for each of those 32 drivers, what we looked at was what's the sort of scenarios of change that could happen for each. So how would all these trends manifest itself in our sectors? So it's one thing to look at sort of insurance broadly, but obviously it becomes more critical to look at it down in the context of you know, a personal P&C, a commercial P&C, individual life, you know, retirement, and what it can, in health, and what it can mean in those. And you know, it's the interesting piece is that, you know, by laying out sort of scenarios from sort of moderate change to a very aggressive change, the intent is not to have some crystal ball and paint what it looks like, but like with any sort of discipline, sort of scenario planning, it's you know, to recognize that the future may be hard to predict, but not impossible to prepare for. So how do we look at those things in a way that says how might it help shape our world, and what can we do within that? And I'm now going to sort of take that and look at, as we looked at some of the implications, not just within each of those trends and how it may manifest itself, but across them. Obviously, it's the combination of how those things are changing that really affect what we're doing. So I'm going to talk about 4 big implications or impact areas that we see as sort of as a factor around those trends, and talk a little bit about examples and sort of early signs of where we're seeing some of those changes occur, which I think sometimes it can be interesting in terms of being provocative around what it may mean to you. So basically, if we look at how insurers are competing, you know, there's sort of new ways of thinking about our geographies, our products, our customer segments and channels. We really look at sort of 4 big areas that I'll talk a little bit about. So the first is really around two-speed growth. So when we look at the global world, it's really sort of shifted between sort of the flat sort of developed markets that don't have a lot of broad growth, and then obviously more of the developing world, where over the next 5 to 10 years are projected to be more growth, slightly less than what was originally estimated, which is so declining, but still certainly from a relative speed standpoint faster. The second one really gets at more of what we call sort of customer evolution, and this is much more so about the notion of taking an outside-in view and looking back at what the implications can be as customer behaviors, demographics, and expectations have changed. What are the implications to us in our sectors? And then the third area is really around information advantage. So I talked a lot about how there's great innovations happening in our ability to capture and consume and interpret and share information in new ways. I don't think there's any surprise there to anyone. There's certainly a lot of hype around big data and what that is. But what does that really mean? I mean, we are in a very information-intensive business. What opportunities does that present in terms of how we operate and create a competitive differentiation with others? And then lastly, let's look at sort of the evolving business and operating models, in many ways enabled by what's happening in the other areas that I talked about. So the first big area is really around two-speed growth. And as I mentioned, this is really, we look in the developed world where the markets are relatively flat. We see insurers looking at how do they steal share from others, how do they look at sort of new products or niche products, new segments that they can pursue, and new ways of getting at those. Additionally, you see them looking at sort of market expansion opportunities. What are the plays that they have around the world, and how can they be thinking about that in certain ways? And then within more of the developing world, obviously, traditional insurance, the traditional opportunities as you see growth in things that and obviously in economic drivers, construction, infrastructure. There's huge plays in commercial P&C as you see an increase in the middle class. and wealth in general, obviously there's a greater need for more insurance. And then sort of broadly, we see sort of a commoditization of the auto insurance market. Certainly in some areas, that's, you know, the price competitiveness has already really taken hold. If you look at what's happened in the UK, in the US market, you see some similar behavior in what's happening. And then on the life side, you see basically a big push on growth as you have a great aging population. How are people looking at how they play in the retirement market? And look at more things around. I think the last speaker talked a little bit about advice, but how do we look at more holistic income solutions? Again, taking sort of a customer view of how can they get help sort of throughout their life cycle as we see continued changes around the sort of integration of health and wealth efforts. So if we look just really quickly, if you look at what we call the SAMI market, so South America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, you know, over the first decade, trade flows within those areas had a compound annual growth of almost 20%, which has far outpaced the rest. So as opposed to flows that tended to start with sort of the Western through to those markets, now that trade is happening obviously within those markets, as well as increased growth among the SAMI market to the non-SAMI market. And that has obviously big implications in terms of where a lot of the flow of activity happens, where certain companies are positioned and structured, but also within that, the largest growth, we talk about demographic growth, by 2030, middle class globally will double. I think this was one of the stats in the video, from 2 billion to almost 5 billion, of which Asia will host 64% of that, with 40% of the middle class consumption. So when we think about where that growth goes, it's quite pronounced in terms of what's happening there. And obviously, if you look at it, it's obviously not just the middle class, it's what's happening with natural resources, what's happening with the growing populations and manufacturing and capital. I think when we talk about the degree of change, I showed sort of the curves of technology change. I think this picture, to me, very quickly sums up how fast the world around us is changing. I mean, you know, I think we've all, you all know, we know that growth, that certainly there's been a lot of growth, but when you see it sort of in this picture, it's remarkable how fast Shanghai has popped up into sort of such a major metropolitan area. We talk about urbanization and what's happening. You saw the stats around how many people are moving to cities. Well, that's where most of that middle class is. And as such, do we look at, in the future, do we look at strategies that are much more urban strategies, and not just what countries do we play in, but how do we really attack the urban markets? And how is the behavior of those who primarily live in cities differ from how we drove traditional reach into broader rural markets in many of these countries? So this sort of just reinforces the notion of two-speed, sort of a visual showing the speed and the difference with the shrinking middle class in the developed markets and versus the rising middle class in the other. Again, drives sort of a difference of, are we really looking at margin extension if we're playing in more of the developed versus market expansion and how we think of the developing markets. And I think interesting when we talk about a rising middle class, I think one of the new things we're seeing, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, are new models of underwriting risk as we look at the demographics change. So that middle class, in many ways, isn't necessarily, if you think of our life products, isn't necessarily what we'd serve today, where they don't necessarily have so much. I heard the last speaker talk a little bit about how do we have simpler products or sort of entry products to them. We also look at ways in which the cost structures can be brought down dramatically to make those more attractive. And today we have, we have distribution models that can be very high cost, which is warranted, where there's obviously a lot of value and a lot of need for some of the advice. How do we actually bring some of that to sort of this new emerging middle class that may still have a need for how to navigate their world, but in a very different way? So basically this chart, a little bit hard to see at her brush, is really just about how we're going to see continued aging population. So really, if you look out, we obviously know we have dependency ratio issues in markets such as the U.S. and Europe and China, But basically, what we see is that everybody's going to live longer, which is great on one hand, and we're going to have a much older population. Like one of the studies we did around life and pensions was that with the global executives, greater than 70% of the life and pension execs believe that the public health provisions will worsen, and 40% think the Social Security systems will crater or certainly will take a big hit. And good news, bad news is that, obviously that puts the onus on what steps in and sort of helps people make sure that they've got a position of what they need to do. How is that going to be addressed, and how may that unfold? If you look at, Japan is an early study of what's happened there, where 25% of the population is over the age of 60. And they saw basically their retirement savings rate drop from 44% in 1990 to about 2% today, which is dramatic when we think of the social implications of what that can be. Interestingly, if we look at what's happening and how people pursue growth, I talked a little bit about low-cost structure in different forms. If you see, markets will not follow the same path to maturity, I think that traditional other insurance markets have taken. And as such, you see big opportunities for innovation, particularly around things that can be low-cost innovations that can help underserved markets, and then have the ability to come back and how that can actually affect more mature markets in new ways. In this case, these are innovations that are happening not directly related to insurance, but you look at basically there are ways in which to solve problems that can deal with things in different ways. The tablet, for one, which is really reinventing education in India, as they have access to more information. It also is enabling a mobile agent force as they improve sort of the ability to have interactive discussions and video to chat for various things that allow you to bring sort of advisory capabilities into a fairly low-cost footprint. Additionally, in mature markets, from a growth standpoint, I mentioned the auto issue. So if you look at the UK and some of the other markets, online aggregators have really anchored consumers on price in the absence of any other important variable. And as such, carriers are basically seeking to reintroduce healthier pricing and differentiation through usage-based insurance to make the pricing difficult to compare. But also looking at combining that with other factors and solutions. Again, taking sort of that customer view. How can we actually provide solutions that make a big difference and establish both in terms of what that conversation is directly with the customer, but also then the guided conversation that happens with an agent or other in our sort of multi-channel model. And to that end, if we think about sort of the customer changes, the big change, when I say power is shifting to the buyers, I think oftentimes people react and say, you think everything will go direct, and this has really nothing. It is not just about that. In essence, the big trend is, I think in many ways that's sort of that inside-out thinking. Most in insurance models where that's gone forward, it's been added as a separate channel. Well, we'll add direct as a play, and the reality is, from a customer standpoint, they're operating very much in a notion of multi-channel. That there is a role of just different activities that they do, people look for in different ways. We have access to information in all new ways. We expect to get it, but we move between them. And certain things we want to get for ourselves and certain things we want sort of help in which to get it. There's also been an increased rise of mobility and a notion of, for those who've seen Amazon, sort of this notion of people like you. In many ways, and Google did a study around the 0 moments of truth and looked across industries. And interestingly, in insurance, they found that people look at almost 11 sources of information before they buy. So if you think about it, in many ways, this is not too dissimilar than we thought of. We saw with I remember years ago, sort of when people buy a car, it wasn't so much to say, well, the person who sells a car doesn't go away. The issue is you can get all the information and gather it for. So when I go in, I feel like I have confidence in what I'm looking for, and they can then help me through it. But I feel more at ease with what that conversation is. Additionally, I think one of the most interesting phenomenons is the willingness by which to provide feedback openly and everywhere. It's certainly nothing I had considered, but certainly everybody, there's a tremendous amount of feedback that happens in real time online. And then you also see things around collective buying power. So in many ways, social networks are not too dissimilar from the affinity groups that we've always known and dealt with, but in many cases they're self-forming, and the technology plays an amplifying effect that allows people to find each other that are somewhat similar in different ways. And you're already seeing some of that collective buying power happen in sort of collaborative financing and lending in different models. So one of the key things that we observed in a number of markets is really around this sort of a segmentation that looks at those that were sort of shopping versus switching. And while shopping as a whole necessarily hasn't changed, the threshold by which people are willing to switch has increased in a lot of markets. And the challenge really is that how do we look at them and understand who are the value-driven segments on one hand, and how do you actually design solutions around them that bring together the whole system that you have, both the customer intelligence, the distribution model, the offerings, and product and service that we think about that can be valuable, but also then how do we make sure that the called serial switchers in some markets don't necessarily undermine a lot of the profit and other pieces that we look at. If I switch to sort of the life space a bit, one of the key things that's happening is this notion of sort of if you take that customer life cycle, I talked about sort of an outside in, more decisions are being pushed on customers. Right? As they live longer, the interplay between their health and their wealth has far greater ramifications. Right? So, I think at one time there was a commercial, a large global life player had said, what's your number when you turn 65? When you turn 65, how much do you need to have saved? And that works great if you tired at 65 and you die at 68. But in many cases, as people are living far, far longer, a health incident up front and early on in that has great ramifications into what happens later. And you see a lot of players, both asset managers and wealth managers, asset managers, and life insurers coming at that sort of retirement market with new innovative products that have sort of hybrid solutions that combine elements of accumulation, deaccumulation, and protection. So these retirement income products from one side, and you have target date funds from another that look at sort of how those solutions can best fit customers. What we're starting to see is, looking at sort of those hybrid solutions, almost embedded advice that's happening earlier on in the life. So the ability for it to change as you evolve actually can grow with you. Additionally, starting to see things around sort of technology-assisted advice that really helps you navigate what's happening here. I think one of the things we always say is, well, you can make products really simple for folks, but our products are very complex. I think the challenge is as we look at what's possible, and there's some good examples of this in some other areas, it's about you can still have things that are sophisticated, but that doesn't mean you have to present the complication. Right? So how do there's a good example. A good example of, I don't know how many people are familiar with Mint. It's mint.com. So it's a U.S.-based company, but it's basically it's an online aggregator that basically has signed up millions of users in a very, very short period. That takes a full picture view of your assets and liabilities. And what it does is, using that notion of people like you, what do others have with you around life insurance? What do they have around other things? And it got a tremendous amount of traction. Interestingly, it was purchased by Intuit. And Intuit, who makes financial planning software, also owns TurboTax. And TurboTax is basically software for the masses in the U.S. market to file their taxes. And the U.S. tax code, you wouldn't know this, but the U.S. tax code is anything but simple. It's a very complex piece, and what they've done is they've actually created very guided instructions around how you actually would navigate it, and then you can then you can talk to somebody to say, have I done it right? And you're starting to see some of this come up around some of the financial products around how we look at it. Companies like Guided Choice and Financial engines are starting to make good penetration in this. And again, it's making things simple without necessarily taking away the sophistication that's necessary within that. And we're seeing a lot of opportunities to really evolve that and think about how that can actually play in this notion of how do we get advice? How might we actually offer advice, not just for the affluent, but down market in many ways, in a way that has a cost structure that's possible. Another interesting example in this space, and we talk about looking at things from a customer standpoint, sort of that outside-in view, is a company called Discovery, which is in South Africa. So Discovery basically has linked driver behavior to auto and short-term life insurance, and they've linked diet and exercise behavior to life insurance. So they're taking a sort of consumer segment view and addressing all their needs. So they provide a holistic needs, but have the ability for the customer to sort of take control, if you will, of what they're doing. They can see how their behaviors and their activities actually play out with the solution that they look at, in this case combining general insurance, life, and health. And in their first year have seen quite a bit of growth. And this really looks at traditional medical checkups, plus telematics, plus vitality index, and some product innovation. So an information advantage. The big changes here, it really is about, when people say, you hear a lot about big data, but really big data, small data, all the data that we have locked within our companies, and all the huge amounts of new sources of information that are becoming available. So new sources, new techniques are creating great new opportunities if we look at both in automating sort of simpler risks, but also in adding a lot of intelligence and differentiated edge as we look at much more complex risks. And then we're also starting on the P&C side, and then on the life and retirement side, people looking at new underwriting variables based on sort of the behavioral and medical data, the vitality index I just mentioned with Discovery, but also things that may help sort of help automate sort of underwriting for sort of lesser risk aspects in life insurance. We did a survey basically talking about how far do we think the use of information will go and how important will it be in creating a competitive differentiation within companies. Basically, this was C-level executives globally. 74% expected the sophisticated use of information and analytics to be the key differentiator. I spoke last week at a conference just following Jay Fishman, who's the CEO of Travelers in the U.S., and Travelers is very, very strong in commercial P&C, and he basically, when asked by the audience, he said, our ability to use information in ways that others haven't come close to getting to yet is really what has made our difference in the last 5 years. And we believe we'll extend that lead continually. So it basically a message that came from the top. I mean, this isn't too dissimilar. Progressive, famously sort of viewed itself as an information company, and what does that do, and how does that change how they operate? But if we really look at what's happening, it's how do you take this is sort of the combining sort of two Nobel economists view together around how do you take the unstructured and make it structured, and so the unstructured strategic and make it structured and operational. How do you really build that intelligence out at the edge of the organization, in the hands of the underwriters who are making the best, the tough decisions, the ability to distinguish what's happening there. A couple really interesting examples around this that I'll point to. So the first is an example around how people are already using this in new ways. So MetLife, basically in 90 days, everyone talks about, well, we can't really do much. We have all these legacy systems. It's a big spaghetti plate. Basically across 70 existing systems, legacy systems, in 90 days we're able to pull, just throw everything into MongoDB, which is new technology around some of the things around big data, and basically pull out a use of what's a view of our customer. And again, this isn't something, you wouldn't do a consolidated bill off of this, it's not perfect, but directionally in terms of how you handle service, what it can be used for in other forms, they found it to be really effective. And it sort of just changes the mindset of how we've typically thought about how we have, what we need to do with our data. Another example is Healthrageous, which is really looking at, we think of telematics in the car. There's a number of players who are doing a lot of things around the connected home, and Healthrageous is one is really around more of the connected or quantified self, as you start to see things around monitoring and other activities. Again, if you think in a really long view, how might this affect us? I won't talk much about the driverless car. I think you've seen it. What's really fascinating when we talked about the pace of change, the automotive industry is very slow to change. And it wasn't that long ago that Google basically put its energies towards, we want to solve a problem around a driverless car. And just a few weeks ago, Nissan announced they'll have a 2020 production line ready. Elon Musk of Tesla announced he'd have one by 2016. They're actually been licensed. They're now able to drive in a number of states. So just the pace by which to get regulatory bodies, state bodies, and sort of automakers to move and respond to that, I think, is staggering. And I think it's less significant about whether or not we'll really have driverless cars everywhere. People love to drive, but you're already seeing huge innovations around what's happening around traffic assist and what that means for loss frequency and severity, and how do we actually think about that, and how do we understand the implications in our insurance models. Skip the wall and talk a little bit lastly about sort of the operating model. I've talked a lot about, in many ways, a lot of the things that are happening around the information, a lot of the technology, certainly around some of the other pieces, really get at our ability to create cost structures that can be much more competitive on a segmented level. So you can have higher cost, higher touch for the high end, but you can use it as a way to introduce into other segments. So how do we begin to really think of the market in segments? How do we think, if I think outside in, one of the big challenges we see is that our operating models today are siloed. They tend to be product-based or at least line-based. And if I looked at customers' needs and how they evolve, like that picture we talked about with Discovery, or if I looked at that cradle-to-grave holistic life cycle of wealth and what that means, it's not we don't necessarily have within our organizations all the parts to this. Each one is approaching the customer from a different angle and asking them to navigate those decisions, or even asking the advisor to navigate those decisions for them. And advisor productivity is a decent challenge that we face today as well. So you have some of the shifts from product-centric to customer-centric business models, and then deaggregating cost structure to broaden, to enter new markets in new ways. So the way I liken it to is really in the old model you had sort of a traditional battleship, and I think most insurers were built like a traditional battleship. Single purpose, integrated, very powerful, could really do its purpose extraordinarily well. Each time you needed to do something, the upgrade cost an awful lot, and we're seeing that a lot today. As people look at some of where they're trapped by their policy admin systems, claim systems, and other things, or shifts in the customer, as opposed to a model that really operates much more like an aircraft carrier. This notion that I can have a platform, but the ability to have integrated sets that allow me to attack segments, that combine intelligence. I talked about big data. This isn't something that's done in a back office in analytics and then determine how it's going to be used. Right? How do you have underwriters who are evaluating very complex risks with people who know how to discover new things in the data? So that combination of technologists, data scientists, and underwriters create a very powerful differentiator as I attack new segments. How do I look at new emergent risks where the historical information that we had may not be as great, but there are new techniques that allow me to actually understand and simulate what can happen to look at those risks in new ways. And just to bring this together in one example, this is a startup actually formed by a few individuals from Google, so formerly from Google. And recently, in fact, it was 2 weeks ago, week and a half, 2 weeks ago, they were acquired by Monsanto, not your traditional insurance competitor. So Climate Corp, just as context, was a startup that was in the crop insurance space that basically looked at it and said, we believe we can use all the external information data available around weather, soil, et cetera, and come up with a better mechanism to understand what yield should be. And we can basically, from a customer connectivity standpoint, recommend to farmers what they need to do. And then on the backside, they've basically, so it's sort of production, productivity yield-based, backstopped by capital in the insurance model for when things go wrong. But what they've done is they've also taken the value chain and they don't have a claims function. Basically, they know what the yield will be. When it drops below a certain amount and they owe the money, they simply put the money, deposit the money in the farmer's account. So, they basically, and there's a lot of things that go into this, big data say from that same data that everybody else can have, they've come up with better ways that were far more determinate of outcomes than anybody else has done. And what's interesting is, so Monsanto looks at this and say, well, we can be end-to-end, right? So this is the press release. We can be the end-to-end help for the farmer. In the whole way, insurance being a big part of that. It's a pretty powerful combination. But what they also really saw was, basically this is a game of talent, it's a game of platform, it's a game of the ability that they've come up with insights that they believe nobody else could replicate quite quickly. And the question is, as we start to think about what's possible and what we do, how does that change where we think about where our talent is? Does it change about how we think about our platform? Does it change about, change how we think about where our opportunities lie and how we pursue them in those new ways? And I think, I'll stop there. I think I won't ask these questions since we're going to get into sets of questions here now.
Thank you, Jamie. Bem, eu acho que vocês têm monte de trabalho, né, pela frente, por tudo que ele apresentou aqui. Eu acho que tem desafios enormes. I think it's a good idea to you to write the questions because we have a lot of questions to you at the end, okay? Rossi, vamos começar com você. Eu queria que você fizesse umas considerações. A gente faz perguntas para ele, ele anota e depois ele termina. Como a gente, mais ou menos o modelo do painel anterior, que eu acho que funcionou bem. Tudo bom?
Okay. Bom, antes de mais nada, eu queria parabenizá-lo aí pela apresentação. Confesso a você que vou dormir mais preocupado essa noite, né? Eu acho assim que são tantos desafios e tantas reflexões, né, no mundo, e quando a gente começa a falar aqui que nós estamos debatendo ou tentando fazer uma provocação com relação a 2025, e quando a gente vê tantas inovações, tantas coisas acontecendo no mundo afora, nos faz aqui ficarmos cada dia mais ansiosos, primeiro com a agilidade daquilo que nós fazemos, segundo, acho que também ansiosos no que diz respeito às oportunidades que nós temos no que diz respeito à criação de produtos, a buscar inovação e também naquilo que é um tema muito frequente aqui no dia a dia nosso, né, de como vai se comportar o futuro no que diz respeito a canais de distribuição, como vai se comportar o futuro na visão de produtos, na inovação, na construção de novos meios, e aquilo que nós não fazemos, às vezes, não muito bem aqui no Brasil, de poder capturar, e me parece que no mundo como um todo, essa questão relacionada a capturar as informações, os dados que nós temos dentro das nossas próprias seguradoras, que esse é um grande desafio. Então, a minha pergunta, acho que a primeira relacionada a isso, né? Como é que ele está enxergando, como você está enxergando a evolução eu sei que você destacou na sua apresentação que isso também é um tema que tem um pouco de fantasia com relação a isso, mas como ele enxerga esse desafio das companhias seguradoras de capturar mais os dados e as informações que tem dentro do seu mundo dos seguros. E o outro tema é um pouco daquilo de como você nos vê. Porque nós sempre escutamos com muita frequência que o mercado segurador é conservador, ele tem assim uma capacidade de reação um tanto quanto mais lenta. Como é que você nos enxerga, né? Como é que você vê o mundo dos seguros e como você vê as companhias que avançarão nesse suposto 2025, né? Quais são as características dessas companhias, né?
Obrigada, Rossi. Eu tenho uma pergunta
É quase uma palestra, né?
Quase uma nova palestra. Ô, Rossi, eu tenho uma pergunta para você. Eu vi você aqui durante a apresentação, olhando, anotando e tal. Você ficou mais preocupado com os riscos ou você ficou mais motivado com as oportunidades? O que você enxergou mais aí?
Eu acho sempre o seguinte, o nosso lado comercial sempre está muito mais presente, felizmente, na nossa vida, né? Aprendi com o doutor Molina esse aspecto. Então, é lógico que, no meu caso especificamente, acho que nós enxergamos inúmeras oportunidades, né? Tem tanta coisa que você pode fazer, que você não está fazendo, tantos pontos que você pode interagir com os produtos. Eu estava aqui conversando um pouco com o Marcio a respeito desse tema. Então, eu vejo muito mais oportunidades. É claro, né, que a tecnologia mudou demais as nossas vidas, né? Transformou demais as nossas vidas. E quando nós olhamos um pouco o passado e quando nós enxergamos o quanto nós vamos avançar, não tem como se negar que, para nós executivos hoje, e eu acho que para todos aqui, também para os corretores, enxergar o caminho, ver o caminho que nós devemos seguir, está um tanto quanto complexo.
Obrigada, Rossi. Bem, vou passar agora para você, Marcio, que você tem um papel importante nesse seu setor, no meio de todos esses riscos, né?
Tá bom. Não, ele colocou o alfabeto, né? Eu queria escolher pelo menos algumas letras desse alfabeto. Ele foi de A a Z, né? E assim, um pouco da impressão que fica, né? Eu vou começar por aí. É como se, não só essa apresentação, né, da PwC, mas outras também que a gente vê, é como se a gente estivesse diante de um filme, não vou falar de terror, não, um filme de ação, né, que acaba como Matrix, né? Então, um mundo que é quase que impossível de ser domado, né, com as tecnologias existentes, e você acaba perdendo um pouco, borrando um pouco, né, tornando menos transparentes os caminhos que você pode seguir. Uma primeira, eu vou inclusive colocar algumas questões, até fazer algumas provocações para o Jamie, né? Inclusive porque eu não vi saúde muito evidenciado nessa apresentação dele. Né? Vi PNC e vi vida. Né? Saúde, alguma coisa. Né? Eu não sei como é que ele enxerga também esse desafio, mas eu vou dizer como é que eu enxergo dentro de algumas letras que eu vou escolher, né? Desse alfabeto que o Jamie colocou. Todas aquelas mudanças, né? Tanto as mudanças intrínsecas ao mercado de seguro, como mudanças da sociedade, da economia, elas afetam diretamente a área de saúde, pública ou privada, não importa. Né? Questões como estão colocadas aí, como a mudança demográfica, né? A mudança do padrão epidemiológico, enfim, as mudanças tecnológicas de todo o sistema, enfim, várias outras mudanças, elas podem afetar daquele outro ramo, não estou dizendo que saúde é melhor do que os outros, não, mas que afetam notadamente saúde, tendo em vista a expressão que ela tem para a sociedade, enfim, o caráter que tem ideológico, econômico, social, político, enfim, né, que alcança a sociedade como um todo. E, efetivamente, o Brasil, eu acho que ainda... A Europa e os Estados Unidos já passou um pouco por esse filme de ação, né, porque é uma sociedade, na realidade, mais velha que a sociedade brasileira, por óbvio, né? É uma sociedade que experimentou a guerra, experimentou racionamento, né? Então, alguns desses desafios, os países centrais, né, que se costuma dizer, os Estados Unidos já estão equacionando há algum tempo. O Brasil agora é quem vem equacionar. Mas como, tanto quanto o Rossi, eu sou um otimista incorrigível, né? Eu acho que as pessoas, o ser humano, ele cuida de resolver seus próprios problemas, né? Senão estaríamos aqui há tantos bilhões de anos, né? Então, até o tema do encontro é esse, cabe a nós, né? Então, eu vou elencar só poucas questões, até para poder provocar mais o Jamie, nos ajudar a refletir. Primeiro, a questão do consumidor. Né? Você colocou que esse consumidor no futuro é um consumidor mais exigente, diferente, mais preparado, enfim, e no caso de saúde, eu acho, no caso da área de saúde especificamente, eu acho que a principal providência é o empoderamento do consumidor de saúde. Ouviu, Maristela? E esse empoderamento do consumidor de saúde não é só para ele ser mais esperto, para ele estar mais... para ele diminuir as suas insuficiências, não. É principalmente para ele poder julgar o que é o melhor para ele para os tratamentos de saúde. Isso ninguém fala. Geralmente, o que se aborda é muito mais a relação do consumidor com a operadora de saúde. Né? Mas é a relação dele principal, que é a relação com o médico, que é a relação com o hospital, que é a relação com o laboratório, com o tratamento que ele está sendo recomendado. Então, ele precisa ser empoderado para ele poder escolher esse tratamento, né? Ele ter as informações sobre isso. Não, claro, ele não vai ser um médico, né? Mas ele tem informações que ele possa julgar, né? É o que, de certa maneira, acontece nos Estados Unidos, né? Porque você tem um produto associado a uma franquia que obriga necessariamente o consumidor a pensar 2 vezes antes dele aceitar um tratamento que lhe foi prescrito. Então, eu acho que tem muito que ser avançado aqui na regulação brasileira, de tal sorte a dar informação para o consumidor possa escolher. Com relação a quem presta esse serviço de saúde, tal como colocado aqui pelo Jamie, que existem várias questões associadas, principalmente com relação à tecnologia, é preciso que ele seja... É preciso que o modelo mude, né, ou vá mudando, né, isso não é questão de anos, de décadas, né, para que os prestadores de serviço eles sejam julgados pelo resultado que eles fazem, outcome, né, no jargão de quem está examinando essa matéria, né, e não, efetivamente, por aquilo só que ele prescreve ou que ele, na realidade, o contato com a pessoa, né? Acho que cada um dos agentes do sistema de saúde, especificamente, tem tarefas, né, urgentes que se colocam desde já, para daqui, pelo menos, até 2025. Né? E, finalmente, questão de tecnologia. Amanhã, acho que vocês vão escutar, quem tiver, né, no debate que a gente vai fazer sobre saúde, eu vou citar. Eu vou citar hoje e vou aborrecer para vocês para citar amanhã. Eu acho que tecnologia é o grande bem, né, que a sociedade trouxe para ela mesma ao longo dos anos. Mas eu fiquei preocupado com uma informação. Está na última revista Economist desta semana, o último número da Economist, é uma matéria sobre ciência e tecnologia. E está lá dito, né, que o Instituto, não vou me lembrar agora o nome, mas eu prometo trazer escrito para vocês, revelou que os Estados Unidos despendeu 67 bilhões de dólares em 2012, 67 bilhões de dólares em 2012, com tecnologia na área médica e biomédica. Dessas 67 bilhões, julgaram, os próprios médicos, né, e cientistas, analistas, julgaram que eles só conseguiriam reproduzir 1/4 disto. 3/4 eles não tinham a menor ideia se aquilo era resolutivo ou não era resolutivo. Tá bom, Economist, né, é uma revista polêmica e tudo mais, mas a própria Economist traz também um dado adicional, dizendo que esse dado, né, do pouco uso da tecnologia, né, do pouco aproveitamento da tecnologia, foi confirmado por outras pesquisas. Então, eu acho que, quando se fala de tecnologia, acho que a gente tem que ter bastante cuidado, né, cautela com relação ao que significa isso, né, o que é que ele pode trazer como benefício mais do que os custos demonstram que se avança. Acho que eu estou tomando tempo demais, né, porque o assunto realmente é muito envolvente, né? E essa questão do Health Radius, né, que foi colocado aí, enfim, né, a grande revolução que ele colocou, embora destinado para a vida, há um problema. Você só consegue aproveitar a informação se o dado existe, né? E no Brasil, não sei a referência que você está colocando, Jamie, no Brasil há muitas restrições com relação à obtenção de dados, estou falando do sistema de saúde novamente, de dados de pacientes. É uma regulação bastante restritiva, que penaliza bastante todo o sistema, então pouco se aproveita do ponto de vista da informação epidemiológica do paciente para poder fazer qualquer esquema preditivo. Ok?
Obrigada. Eu acho que todos esses temas que foram colocados aqui, de certa forma, a gente está encontrando com eles no dia a dia, né? Agora, eu nunca tinha visto, por exemplo, um estudo assim tão bem elaborado, com números que deixa a gente assim realmente assustado, né, da velocidade que isso está acontecendo e a magnitude do que está acontecendo. Marco, eu vou pedir para você continuar.
Jamie, primeiro, compartilhar aí com o presidente Rossi, parabéns pela sua apresentação, eu acho que foi extremamente importante para nós que estamos pensando o mercado segurador em 2025. E quando a gente remete à apresentação, a gente entende que, ao pensar 2025 aqui no Brasil, nós estamos pensando no conjunto dos mesmos drives que foram aqui colocados, né? Drive social, drive tecnológico, drive econômico, drive político, mudança no comportamento do consumidor, a questão do clima, a questão da distribuição, a questão do Big Data, das redes sociais. Enfim, todas essas variáveis são fundamentais para que a gente possa fazer um exercício e imaginar como é que nós vamos estar em 2025 e agir desde agora para que a gente possa, então, cumprir uma profecia autorrealizável, ou seja, chegar em 2025 com essa visão. Mas a ideia aqui, e a pergunta para você, é se fôssemos capazes, né, de fazermos disso um modelo, temos um programa com todas essas variáveis, e criarmos um choque, né, para cada uma dessas variáveis, na sua opinião, o que mudando daquilo que a gente imaginou ex ante, né, poderia contribuir positivamente para uma mudança de tendências do mercado, ou negativamente, ou se, na sua opinião, essas variáveis isoladamente não seriam capazes de produzir uma mudança nas tendências do mercado dos próximos anos. Ou seja, só esse conjunto, né, agindo de forma harmônica, que produziria determinados resultados, positivos ou não. Então, na realidade, a gente sempre discute, de alguma maneira, e isoladamente esses fatores, mas eles agem sempre em conjunto, sempre de forma dinâmica. Aí a pergunta é, isoladamente, algum deles, né, e, de novo, por isso que, se fôssemos capazes de provocar um choque, eles seriam capazes de transformar isso?
Eu vou acrescentar na sua pergunta, se a gente pudesse ranquear todos esses pontos que você colocou, enfim, entre mudanças climáticas, longevidade, tecnologia, ataques terroristas, enfim, as questões geopolíticas, qual que eu tenho que me preocupar primeiro? Qual é aquele que tem um impacto mais relevante nesse momento, que eu deveria estar prestando mais atenção? Osvaldo, eu vou passar para você, porque eu acho que você e o Marcio, longevidade, né, aumento da expectativa de vida, é um ponto que estava aqui permeando a apresentação, e você vê que ele sempre destaca ali a questão da aposentadoria, a questão comportamental. Eu vou pedir para você continuar com a sua análise.
Okay. Eu, a rigor, vou até aproveitar que o Molina está ali na frente, por falar em longevidade. Mas eu vou fazer uma pequena retrospectiva. Ela vai ser muito rápida, apesar da data de referência ser muito lá atrás, porque eu particularmente participei das transformações. Então, em 73 eu estava na Escola Politécnica da USP, nós estávamos saindo da válvula para o transistor, e as empresas estavam muito distantes da computação. E o Brasil e o mundo começavam a discutir a comunicação por micro-ondas. Não tinha comunicação. A comunicação no Brasil era por tropodifusão. E lá a gente já fazia projeções do futuro e até conseguia imaginar o que poderia acontecer. O que se imaginava, obviamente, é que as companhias teriam avanços na área de computação. 10 anos depois, em 83, por acaso eu estava fazendo mestrado nos Estados Unidos, na área de Computer Science. E foi nessa época que surgiu o advento do microcomputador. E começou-se a liberar a ARPANET, que era utilizada pelas Forças Armadas Americanas, para o uso pela sociedade civil, que se transformou no futuro na internet. E lá onde eu estava estudando, estava se começando a discutir teoria de banco de dados. A rigor, começou-se a discutir o modelo relacional dos bancos de dados, que foi, de certa forma, o que originou, na época, a Oracle e o próprio DB2. E começou a trabalhar Artificial Intelligence, cuja projeção era para 30 anos à frente, inclusive para a avaliação dos modelos de risco. Isso aconteceu em 83. E já se imaginava os modelos de CRM baseados na experiência do passado. Nós mesmos estudávamos isso, acho que algumas pessoas aqui certamente estão familiarizadas. 10 anos depois, 93... eu estava muito envolvido com a área de telecomunicações. Inclusive, participei da primeira experiência de celular que ocorreu em Phoenix, nos Estados Unidos. Começou-se a discutir mobility, tá certo? Começou-se a discutir a internet mais disseminada para a população, e o CRM começou a fazer parte da estratégia das empresas, procurando identificar qual o comportamento do indivíduo.